Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, how the largest moving object ever fashioned by the hand of man hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank in the middle of the North Atlantic. 1,500 lives were lost. The tragedy has been well documented in books and on film. No matter how often the story is told, it never fails to capture our imagination. Yet, it is a story that has left many questions unanswered. Now, for the first time, we take a fresh look at some of the mysteries surrounding the Titanic and reveal evidence that leads to a compelling and shocking hypothesis: that the ship that plummeted 2 miles to the bottom of the sea was not the Titanic, but its sister ship, the Olympic.
And I thought, oh, now I'll go up and get out of all this scrumming and go on the poop deck. And she was sinking fast then. And all of a sudden she lifted up quickly and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her. And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave. And I was hanging on to a board. We had 2 boards, starboard and port, which said, keep clear for pillar blades. And I was hanging on to one of these and I was getting higher and higher in the air. And I thought, well, now I'll go. And I dropped in. I had a lifebelt on. And I hit the water with a terrific crack. And luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. There were bodies all over the place. And then I looked up at the Titanic. So the propellers were right out of water, the rudder was right out, and I could see the bottom. And then gradually she glided away, and that was that. That was the last of the Titanic.
When did you first realize how serious things were?
I didn't think it was serious because I didn't think it was possible a big ship like that could sink.
Subsubbers. You may not even realize it, but movies and TV are the greatest form of propaganda existing even today. When you think about the Titanic, most of the things you know about it likely stem from the 1997 classic starring Leo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, a VHS double tape set because it was too big for just one tape. Spanning a total of 3 hours and 14 minutes long, the saga of Titanic is a tragic love story, and I don't really know anybody that has not seen that movie. So when you think about the Titanic, most of what you know likely stems from what you saw in that movie. And though they tried to be as historically accurate as they could be, what if the history of the Titanic was where things were actually a little murky? The movie Titanic was so powerful because of the raw emotion attached to it. You get to watch the unthinkable happen to the unsinkable right before your very eyes. You cannot even imagine what it would have been like to be on that boat, and you can certainly not imagine what 28-degree Atlantic Ocean water feels like, especially when you consider that most of the newspapers at the time were reporting tons of conflicting information, sometimes reporting certain people as already dead, when there's no way they could have known that. They hadn't recovered their body, and they hadn't even returned back to New York from being saved off the Titanic. Outside of these news reports, the only way to know what happened would be through personal experiences and stories shared by actual survivors from the crash. And that's exactly what happened with 63 such survivors, whose testimony laid the foundation for a 1955 book by Walter Lords called A Night to Remember. This book was essentially a history of the Titanic and was widely accepted as the actual story of what happened. What makes this book so interesting is that the author, Walter Lords, was actually a former member of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Now, the OSS would later go on to be another 3-letter agency known as the CIA. So why is this guy suddenly writing a historical account of what happened to the Titanic, which would end up being what the 1997 film was based on as well? And one of the other interesting things about this book is how few recollections of the ship actually breaking in half were recorded. So what if they're trying to hide something? And what if the Ocean Gate Titan was on their way down to maybe do some digging. Maybe the ocean gate didn't implode like they say. To get some answers, we too have to travel down into the midnight zone, 3,800 meters, to one of the deepest points of the North Atlantic Ocean, where the Titanic has been laying for 113 years. And it's pretty deep down there, you guys, so
let's go. Alcohol.
All right. Welcome back to Sobering Stories with your boy, DJ Petrovsky. If this is your first time here, well, you made it this far, so you are now qualified to be able to tap or smash or just press the subscribe button. And if you want to do me a favor, if you're already liking the content so far, I would absolutely love if you hit the like button because, well, that helps me out. And I'm trying to get out of this shadow ban. If you are a returning subscriber, Subsobers, I really appreciate you guys coming back each and every week, and you guys are the reason I'm here, so thank you. Now, not many people know that there was another historical documentation of what happened on the Titanic. That happened 14 years before the Titanic sank. In 1898, a book called The Wreck of the Titan almost exactly describes what happened on the Titanic. The ships were nearly the same size. The Titanic was 882 feet, whereas the Titan was only about 800 feet. They were both in the North Atlantic Ocean when they were both sunk because they hit an iceberg, and both ships were considered to be unsinkable.
In April of 1912, the largest ship in the world began its maiden voyage. She was fitted with the finest luxuries in the world, carried the minimum requirement of lifeboats, and had enough watertight compartments and safety features to be considered practically unsinkable. But on a cold April night, it struck an iceberg and vanished beneath the seas. Everyone knows this description to be of the Titanic. However, what you may not know is that 14 years before the Titanic disaster, a struggling author by the name of Morgan Robertson wrote a book titled Futility. It concerns a ship that was the largest in the world. It was fitted with the finest luxuries available, carried the minimum requirement of lifeboats, and had enough watertight compartments and safety features to be considered practically unsinkable. But on a cold April night, it struck an iceberg and vanished beneath the seas. This fictional ship was called the Titan.
Now, not only are the names of these two ships very similar, the route that they took was nearly identical, and the size of the ships are nearly identical, but they were also traveling at roughly the same speeds, between 20 and 25 knots, and even weirder, they were both hit on the starboard side of the ship. The starboard side would be the right side of the ship if you're facing the front of the ship. Port side would be the left side. That's where ships would typically port, and they had to change the name because the original name was too similar to starboard side, so they had to change it to port side. But that's about all I know because I'm actually just in charge of the poop deck. The only differences between these two stories was the fact that the Titan sank in 18 minutes, whereas the Titanic sank in like 2 hours and 40 minutes or something. But this just begs the question, was this just some best-selling story plot? Or did this serve as some sort of inspiration for future events? Because 14 years later, the Titanic would sink, just like the Titan. And even weirder, the Titan, the submersible that imploded, also sank. Now, I did want to mention briefly that some of the footage in the video is going to be my own personal footage from the Titanic exhibit that just rolled through Denver. My kid is obsessed with Titanic, so we had to take him up to see it.
I'm gonna jump in.
I was taking a video. And that was kind of my inspiration for this video because there was some things there that I was reading about, and I've already known about some of the alternate theories about the Titanic, but seeing that exhibit just made me even more curious. Check out the pattern of this floor on the Titanic. Check out the pattern of this floor that was in the Titanic. Tell me that's not a black sun.
The Masonic idea was perhaps first suggested by this passage in the Gospel of St. John. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat him down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. The word here translated pavement is in the original Lithistan, which the very word used by Pliny to denote a mosaic pavement. The mosaic pavement is an old symbol of the order. It is met with the earliest rituals of the last century. It is classed among the ornaments of the lodge in combination with the indented tessel and the blazing star. Stones of black have been readily or appropriately interpreted as symbols of good and evil of human life.
So there is some things I'll include from that exhibit you guys can see. But yeah, anyways, now just some brief history on the Titanic. It was the second of 3 gigantic ships that were being built by the White Star Line. Originally, the White Star Line was a British government-owned entity, but they would eventually sell to JP Morgan under certain conditions. One of the main conditions was that they could repurpose any of those ships at any time to the Royal Navy in the event that they needed it for something. Seems fair, but also seems a bit foreshadowing, like they knew something was coming. At the time, White Star Line's biggest competitor was Cunard, and they were making really large steamships that could travel extremely fast, making intercontinental travels so that passengers could make it from, England all the way to the Americas and pretty much anywhere. In order to compete with Cunard, they decided to come up with a plan to make their ships the biggest moving objects on Earth. They may not reach the same top speeds, but they were built for luxury. They were considered giant hotels on the water. These massive floating hotels were going to be considered the Olympic class ships, and so fittingly they named their very first ship the RMS Olympic. RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship, which just means it's a certified ship that is able to carry royal mail to and fro. So there was massive compartments of the ship designated just for sorting and storing mail that was being delivered intercontinentally. Now, this ship was mainly used for transatlantic travels, and the ship was used starting in 1911, but then in September of 1911, it got into, a little fender bender. The Olympic was traveling down the Solent, which is just a strait that lines the mainland of England, and they were running really close to the HMS Hawke. At some point, because of the massive size of the Olympic, the waves that were happening were just causing the boat to be sucked closer to the Olympic. Inevitably, the Hawke smashed into the starboard side close to the stern, putting a massive hole in the side of the ship. The HMS Hawke was actually made as like a battering ram ship, so it was reinforced on the front side with this giant spike penetrating thing that was supposed to sink ships. But both ships survived, and the Olympic was able to limp back to Southampton, and eventually it would have to make it all the way back to Belfast, Ireland, which is where all of these ships were being built by Harland and Wolff. It was the only shipping yard in the entire world that could handle ships of this size. This just so happens to be the same place where Titanic is sitting, still under construction. At this point, it's only about 2/3 of the way done. Now, obviously, there's a massive hole in the ship, so they had to patch this hole up, and then they had to put 2 reinforcing bars inside of the hull to reinforce that part of the ship because it had been damaged. Some of the integrity of that area was now compromised, so they had to put some extra bars and barriers into that area to keep it functional, really. And I just wanted to quickly mention that it was nearly impossible for me to find any pictures of the Olympic's starboard hull after this collision happened, and technically after the repairs would have been done. I found one picture, ironically enough, from April 15th, 1912, and it doesn't look like there's any damage to this hull. And any other pictures I found of the starboard side hull, they conveniently cut it off right before you get to the area where the damage would have been. It's a little fishy. But the other thing that was damaged was the starboard side propeller blade. So this had to be replaced because the Olympic being out of commission and the Titanic not being finished yet, that meant that White Star Line wasn't making any transatlantic voyages and they weren't making money. So in order to get the Olympic back up and running faster, they borrowed one of the propeller blades from the Titanic. The Olympic would be back into service by November of 1911, but not for very long, because February of 1912, it experienced another setback. One of the propeller blades actually fell off the ship. So yet again, they had to borrow something else from the Titanic, putting another propeller blade on the Olympic, further delaying the finishing of the Titanic. With all the troubles with the Olympic, as well as the prospect of making more money by having two operatable ships, the White Star Line was extremely excited to get the Titanic finished and ready for its maiden voyage. In fact, the White Star Line said, "We need to have this ship ready as soon as possible." The Titanic was finished in January of 1912. Typically, all ships have to undergo extensive testing, speed testing, lifeboat testing, life preserver testing. They have to do different drills so that they know how to load and unload lifeboats. There's all kinds of things that go into testing a brand new ship to make sure that it's safe and operable for people to make these long transatlantic voyages. But because Titanic had already scheduled its maiden voyage for April of 1912, they were under a serious time crunch to get this ship operable, and in order to do that, they had to skip out on some of the safety testing, which included a speed test, safety boat tests, life jacket tests, pretty much any of the major tests that you would think would be required so that this ship would be safe to travel. Now, the Titanic and the Olympic were almost identical in every single way, outside of a few key differences. One of the more subtle, less noticeable differences between the two ships would be the wheelhouse, which is basically where they steer the ship from. But on the Olympic, it was a rounded wheelhouse, and on the Titanic, it was flat. Another slightly less notable difference would be the bridge wings. Apparently on the Titanic, they weren't flush like they were on the Olympic. They actually hung out over the side of the ship a little further, so they'd have better visibility. The more noticeable differences came from when you look at the sides of the ships, and you can see that on Titanic's A deck, they actually enclosed 1/3 of the A deck so that it would cover passengers from any sort of sea splashing. On the Olympic, it was completely left open, not enclosed, and you can see it by the difference in the windows. The other very noticeable difference between the two ships would be the B deck, which is just below the A deck. On the Olympic, it was just left as this long open promenade or walkway, but on the Titanic, they decided to utilize that space as a better way to entertain their first-class passengers, and they made a bunch of first-class cabins and dining areas, and they enclosed the area a little bit more. But you can see the difference in the two ships on the B deck because you can see that the windows on the Titanic are kind of weirdly unevenly spaced, but the windows on the Olympic are perfectly evenly spaced. Another noticeable difference between the two ships that was actually changed before the maiden voyage of the Titanic was the number of portholes on the bow of the ship. On the Titanic, you can see 14 portholes that line, towards the top of the underside of the ship. However, on the Olympic, you see 16 portholes. But then fast forward to April of 1912, the Titanic is embarking on its maiden voyage. There's 16 portholes at that point. So it kind of begs the question, where'd these other two come from? Supposedly, they learned some lessons from the Olympic and decided last minute to throw in these 2 more portholes. That doesn't make any sense with how rushed the construction of the Titanic was. It was so rushed that they were taking shortcuts in terms of the rivets that they were using to actually put all of these pieces of the hull together. Instead of using steel for the rivets, they ended up using iron. And iron has little pieces of slag in it, which makes it a lot more brittle and breakable. It's not nearly as strong as steel. So not Wendy's approved because they're cutting corners. And yet they're going to carve out 6 more weeks, which is what it would typically take to add 2 more portholes onto this ship. It doesn't seem like a very necessary change. It was mostly for the crew, so I could see it maybe being for the passengers with how much pressure was being put on having this first-class experience. It doesn't really make sense to change that and waste all that time just for the crewmates to be able to see better, have better ventilation. As magnificent as the Olympic was, the Titanic was planned to be even better, even more luxurious, and though they were the exact same ship, technically the Titanic was slightly larger. One of the major selling points of the Olympic was its sheer size. in competition with Cunard and the Lusitania, they felt like the one thing that could separate them was this was the biggest ship ever made by that point in time. Just prior to the maiden voyage made by the Olympic, there was tours set up, people could pay a shilling, all the money went to charity, and they could check out this massive ship. They could check out the biggest moving object on the earth at that time. But one thing I found very interesting that you don't really see much about the Olympic is it was not marketed as an unsinkable ship. And if it was, that was not one of the selling points of the ship. In contrast, the marketing for the Titanic seemed to be way more focused around attracting wealthy elites. They talked about renovations made from things they learned from the Olympic. They talked about how there was more first-class amenities and nicer staterooms and dining areas. One of the biggest selling points for the ship was that it was unsinkable. This was the safest ship that you could ride on, the safest transatlantic voyage you could ever take, as well as the most luxurious. But then I found out that neither of the ships were marketed as unsinkable. It was only mentioned maybe 3 times, kind of in passing, and it was never said definitively that these ships are unsinkable. In each case, they say practically or only in certain circumstances could this ship sink, but they never say 100% this ship is unsinkable. So where did this come from? Is this just a myth? And this is something that I haven't really seen anybody else talk about. The ship being labeled as unsinkable was kind of interesting to me because they didn't market the Olympic as unsinkable. Nothing in all of the advertisements I saw talk about it being an unsinkable ship even a little bit. But then the Titanic rolls out, and suddenly one of the biggest selling points is the fact that it's unsinkable. Well, they wouldn't really know if it was or not unless it's already been tested. And the Olympic had already withstood multiple instances where it withstood damage and made it out okay. It has proven itself to be unsinkable. So this is going to attract tons of wealthy elites, tons of huge money business tycoons from the time. On top of everything else, there was word that JP Morgan himself was going to be embarking on this maiden voyage on the Titanic. So if there's anything that was going to attract the wealthy elites to want to ride on this ship, it would be that. The ability to rub elbows with a bunch of other wealthy elites. The only documented time I was able to find that JP Morgan rode the Olympic was after the sinking of the Titanic in July of 1912. There were amazing luxuries on both ships, but especially on the Titanic. Everything on that ship was just pure aesthetics. It was definitely a first-class liner. And one of the things that really added to the first-class feel were all the different cooling houses and bath houses and the beautiful hand-painted tiles that they actually had to put up on the walls just to really decorate and make this room shine. While I was at the Titanic exhibit up in Denver, I noticed that there was a bathhouse tile, had a pretty big crack in it, and there's a little plaque that said that this is one of the most controversial pieces of the Titanic. And it got me wondering why. And then I read that this tile was finally shipped to be added to the Titanic in December of 1911. When they got the shipment, the tiles had really poor gloss on them. It was cracking, the colors were really off, and it just wasn't satisfactory for the ship. So they ended up returning the tiles back to the manufacturer, and obviously they'd have to get new tiles. Now, the thing that is interesting about these Turkish bath tiles is that it would take roughly 3 to 6 months for them to get a new shipment of these hand-painted tiles that were actually up to par. So you would imagine that these tiles never got installed in the Titanic. But when we look at videos and footage that was obtained from the wreckage of the Titanic on the ocean floor, we've got a very perfect, beautiful picture of one of the cooling rooms or one of the bathhouse rooms that has these Turkish tiles in it. So how did these tiles get into the ship? I thought it was very interesting that even the Titanic exhibit points this out. Officially, the Titanic was finished on March 31st of 1912, and on April 2nd of 1912, it was actually removed from the dry dock and was getting ready to set sail on its maiden voyage. Like I mentioned before, there was minimal, if any, testing that went on with the Titanic, which is another thing that is pretty peculiar. It's almost like they already knew how this ship ran. On the evening of April 2nd, the ship departed from Belfast on its way to Southampton, England, and this is where it would eventually load up and embark on its maiden transatlantic voyage. In less than 24 hours, the Titanic would arrive in Southampton. The entirety of the crew was made up of workers from Belfast. Now, it is worth mentioning that at this very same time in the UK, from February until early April, there was a huge coal strike going on. With these steamships obviously running on coal, there were very few, if any, ships that were actually making any travels. You can also imagine how difficult it would be for all of these workers that work down in the boiler room, that were shoveling coal, these firemen. You'd imagine that it's very difficult for them to find work with this massive coal strike going on. Despite the strike, the Olympic and the Titanic were still floating around freely, and it's said that crewmates from the Titanic went around in Southampton begging and pleading and buying up as much coal as they possibly could so that they could make this voyage, this maiden voyage. Once they got to Southampton, nearly all of the coal workers, the boiler room guys, the firemen, they all got off the ship and refused to sign up for another voyage on the Titanic. They didn't want to be a part of this maiden voyage. Why? Especially when there's a coal strike going on. There can't be that much work. What's happening? So after stocking up on firemen and boiler room workers from the Southampton area, some other weird things with the crew took place. The White Star Line management team decided to appoint Captain Edward Smith, who was the captain from the Olympic, to be the captain of the Titanic for this maiden voyage. I guess they figured he had the experience, he had the track record, and he'd be the perfect guy for the job. But when we look at Captain Smith's track record, he has multiple instances where his ego seemed to get in the way, and he ended up in these interesting collisions or just interesting circumstances that ultimately cost the White Star Line money. So in my opinion, he doesn't actually have the most clean track record or this amazing record of success as a captain. Quite the opposite. But it wasn't just Captain Smith that got transferred. It's like the entire leadership of the Titanic was transferred over from the Olympic, which I found to be kind of interesting because the Olympic was now recommissioned. It was fixed and back on the water. So why weren't they staying on that ship? Kind of strange. Also transferred over from the Olympic was Chief Officer Henry Wilde. With him being transferred over as Chief Officer, that would demote the current Chief Officer Murdoch down to First Officer, and then that current First Officer, Charles Lightoller, he was demoted down to Second Officer. The current Second Officer was a guy named David Blair. He was completely kicked off the Titanic altogether. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that is fairly well known about this removal of David Blair is that when he left the ship, the guy took the keys to the box that houses the binoculars that are in the crow's nest for guys to look out for icebergs. So they weren't actually able to access the binoculars on this maiden voyage. You effed up, Dave. I think one of the most interesting pieces about this whole situation, though, is that Chief Officer Henry Wilde, upon being transferred to the Titanic, had written his sister a letter. And within this letter, what he says is, "I still don't like this ship. I've got a very queer feeling about it." Why would he say still? This ship has never gone anywhere. This ship has never sailed before. This is the maiden voyage. How can you still not like it? Unless this ship was not the Titanic, but was in fact the Olympic, of which he had sailed many times as the chief officer. But we're at April 10th now. The maiden voyage is about to embark, and one of the most peculiar things that happens right before the ship takes off is that JP Morgan decides to cancel his ride on the Titanic. Not only JP Morgan, but 50 of his closest business associates, who are all very wealthy individuals, also canceled their trip on the Titanic for very strange reasons. JP Morgan says that he was ill and he was not able to ride the ship. He was just too sick. But 2 days later, he was photographed with his mistress out shopping in France. So how sick was he really? Now, some of these wealthy elite friends of JP Morgan that didn't end up boarding the Titanic, people like Henry Clay Frick, were some very powerful individuals indeed. Milton Hershey, obviously the Hershey's chocolate empire owner, George Washington Vanderbilt II, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt Guglielmo Marconi, who was the inventor of the Marconi radio wireless transmission so they could send Morse code on ships, Theodore Dreister, who was an author, John R. Thompson, who was a restaurateur, and Horace J. Harding, who was a banker. These are just a few of the wealthy elite friends of J.P. Morgan that last minute canceled their voyage on the Titanic. Now, there were many others, and cancellations are not something that's totally out of the question or super weird, but it is kind of strange that all of these friends of J.P. Morgan suddenly don't board the ship, and neither does J.P. Morgan. Why? But despite all these cancellations, on April 10th of 1912, the Titanic embarked upon its maiden voyage with the final destination of New York City, all the way across the Atlantic. Before embarking on this long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, they had to make 2 more stops to pick up more passengers. They stopped in Cherbourg and Queenstown. They picked up numerous passengers and finally ended up with a total crew and passenger count of 2,224 people. Now, this seems like a lot of people, but the Titanic had a full capacity of roughly 3,600 guests, and that would also include the crew. So it wasn't even full. And for a really hyped up maiden voyage on the Unsinkable ship with all of these wealthy tycoons and all these other people on board, how come they didn't fill it up? Finally, on April 11th at about 1 p.m., the Titanic leaves Queenstown and embarks on its long transatlantic journey headed for New York. As most of you guys know, it wouldn't make it. Now, it was smooth sailing for the Titanic for a good couple days. One thing I did find very interesting, though, on April 14th, a guy named Lawrence Beasley, who was no stranger to taking transatlantic voyages, he had sailed and been on multiple different ships, he noticed that there was a slight list to port. And if you're not sure what that is, I didn't either, had no idea. So I had to look it up. So a little fun fact for you guys, a list to port means that there is a slight slant towards the port side of the ship, which would be the left side of the ship. Now, Beasley thought that he noticed this, but after a couple of days, he was like, no, I definitely noticed this. Like, there's definitely a slight tilt here. So at lunchtime on April 14th, he decided to go sit at the purser's table so that he could hopefully spark up some conversation with one of the crew members, hoping to let them know, like, yo, this is what I saw. Maybe you guys can help me test it. We can see if this is actually legit. So they ended up chatting for a while and looking out the portholes to try and test and see if there was any difference between the view out of the left side versus the view out of the right side portholes. And they came to the conclusion that there was, in fact, a slight list to port. Now, you would be very interested to know that after the HMS Hawk had its collision with the Olympic, there was a noticeable roughly 2.5 degree list to port of the ship following that accident. So it begs the question, was the Titanic poorly constructed, or is this not the Titanic at all? Despite Mr. Beasley's warnings, the crew basically ignored him. There was no reason to worry about it. Who cares? There's a slight slant. What are we going to do about it? Truthfully, the slant really wouldn't matter in about 6 more hours. Starting at about 8 or 9 o'clock, the Titanic starts getting different distress signals from ships in the area, talking about how there is tons and tons of ice and icebergs and to be extremely careful. One very interesting ship that was sending distress signals was the SS Californian. Now, this ship had left 5 days prior to the Titanic, was following nearly the same trajectory headed to New York, and somehow the two of these ships ended up near this iceberg-infested water scene at about the same exact time. It is entirely normal for these icebergs to be here. Most of them break off from, glaciers and things up near Greenland, and then they float in this Labrador current along the Canadian coast, and eventually they get dispersed into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, at this time, the oceans were relatively calm. There wasn't a very massive current coming in from the Atlantic Ocean, so this Labrador current was able to flow further out because there wasn't as much resistance coming in from currents from the Atlantic. So these icebergs were actually allowed to float even further out than they normally were. Now, these ships fully expected to come close or run into areas where there would definitely be icebergs. They were familiar with this route and they were familiar with the currents and how things worked. But because the ocean was particularly calm at that time, there was a phenomenon known as a thermal inversion. Essentially, the cold air and the cold currents from the Labrador current met up with the Gulf Stream currents, which are mostly made up of warm air and warmer water. This was keeping the icebergs from floating further out, and they were actually staying in this one little area and starting to pile up. So there was more of them than they were used to, especially since they already knew this route. Now, the story goes that the SS Californian decided to wait out the icebergs until the next morning. It was too dark, and they just figured it was unsafe to try and plow through. So they decided to sit. They kept their boilers on, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, because if they're just chilling, why waste the energy? Why waste the coal? There was just a huge coal strike that they just got through, so coal was not overly abundant. So why would they just sit there leaving their boilers on? Even more strange, the captain of this ship, Captain Stanley Lord, decided that instead of, staying up and keeping an eye out to see if maybe there was an opening or maybe it would be safe for them to travel at any point, he decided that he was just going to put on his jammies and go to bed. Despite all the warnings from ships like the Californian and other nearby ships that were experiencing the exact same situation, the Titanic never received any of those messages. The guys that were down in the Marconi room, which is where they were transmitting messages and sending out messages to, friends and relatives of all the passengers, they were totally bogged down by sending all these personal messages for passengers that they didn't receive any incoming wireless transmissions from any of these ships. So they had forewarning, but they didn't even know that they were sailing right into a death trap. At 11:39 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were sitting in the crow's nest. They were scouting out looking for icebergs. For whatever reason, they didn't notice a massive one coming up on their starboard side. Now, I guess there is a little bit of science to this because of how clear and calm the water was and how calm the night was. There's something known as a superior mirage. To be honest, I'm not fully understanding it. I think I've seen it before. Essentially, a superior mirage occurs when you are looking out over a super clear night sky, very clear, calm waters, and because it is so calm and clear, there's this weird light refraction that causes there to be a haze along the waterline. So you end up seeing a horizon that is slightly higher than the actual horizon line. So this could have completely covered up the iceberg simply because they couldn't see it. Now, had they had the binoculars, they probably would have been just fine. But they didn't. You effed up, Dave. According to most mainstream reports, when they noticed the iceberg, they were only about 500 feet away from it, which would give them very little time to maneuver away from this thing. During the British inquiry after the sinking of the Titanic, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were asked exactly what the distance was to the iceberg when it was spotted. Initially, everything was saying 500 feet, but in the inquiry, he said that the iceberg was the size of like 2 tables when he first saw it, and it continued to get larger as they approached it. So it makes it sound like it was a whole lot further away than 500 feet. It takes about a quarter mile for the Titanic to come to a complete stop, especially traveling 20 plus knots. It takes about 900 feet for the ship to effectively turn one direction or the other. So 1,500 feet should have been ample time for them to make a decision and turn away from it and avoid this giant iceberg. But the piece that probably had the biggest effect was the speed that they were traveling. Because Captain Smith was under intense pressure from White Star Line to make this voyage in less time than they had even quoted, trying to arrive on Tuesday night as opposed to Wednesday, they were told that if they could push it, if they could full throttle the Titanic, if they could get this thing moving at top speed, 20 to 25 knots, then they would make extra good time, and this would be extra pleasing to the passengers and would be super good for publicity. So this is what we would consider a perfect storm. It seems like everything lined up perfectly for this thing to just go down. And as I mentioned before, Captain Smith has a history of sailing with an ego, thinking that he can do whatever he wants, especially being the captain of a ship deemed unsinkable. He probably had no fear at all. He's like, just push on through, full speed ahead. So with this in mind, at 11:40 p.m., just 1 minute after spotting the iceberg, the ship is thrown into reverse so that it will hopefully try and stop the ship, and they turn hard port side, which would be left, trying to veer out of the direct line of this iceberg. I'm sure most of you guys know the story, but the iceberg scrapes super hard along the starboard side of the ship. It doesn't actually poke holes in the ship at all. It doesn't slice the ship open. It doesn't do anything like that. It basically just hit the ship so hard that it bent the steel plates, causing them to move or fall off or get dented in, which suddenly allowed for water to start rushing in. It was no longer waterproof. And it ended up flooding 6 full compartments because it would fill each one and then go over the bulkheads because they weren't truly water sealed, even though they say they were. The ship was only able to withstand 4 of those compartments being flooded to stay afloat. So as soon as you hit 5 or 6, the unthinkable happens to the unsinkable. Now, the only witnesses to this iceberg actually hitting the ship were all crewmates, people who were driving the ship, lookouts, crewmates who were working, keeping the ship going a certain direction. People who were already in the know about what happened. It's not until an hour later, around 12:45, that people start taking this whole situation seriously. They start telling people to throw life vests on, get to the lifeboats, let's start moving women and children off first, and slowly they start getting people down. It's a 70-foot drop from the side of the Titanic down to the water, and keep in mind, it's pitch black, so it's got to be super dark out there on the water. The only lights are coming from the Titanic, maybe a little bit of moonlight, but because there was no waves or any craziness with the sea, we can assume that the moon was probably not full, not close. There wasn't a lot of tide going on. As most of you guys know, the Titanic didn't want the deck of the ship to look all ghetto, so they only stocked 20 lifeboats on the ship. There weren't enough lifeboats on board to maintain the ship's aesthetics, but I've got to say, those boats sure are aesthetically pleasing. Now, each lifeboat can support roughly 65 people. If you do the math on that, you get about 1,300 motherfuckers that you can actually fit in these lifeboats. As a reminder, there was 2,224 motherfuckers on the Titanic. One thing that I did learn, though, that I found to be kind of crucial to our story here, is that the lifeboats were really not designed for actually like saving tons of lives if a ship sinks. It's mostly just to get passengers from one ship to another ship that's nearby. Hopefully they're there in time and they can help this ship, but unfortunately, with the Titanic, that wasn't the case. We've already talked about the SS Californian, but I didn't mention that they were literally 19 miles away from the Titanic. They had left 5 days prior and somehow ended up in the same place, basically, at the same time. Now, the interesting thing about the Californian is that it was the closest ship, but they didn't do anything to help the Titanic. They didn't end up going to rescue any people on lifeboats. They didn't do anything. The ship itself was pretty peculiar. Number one, it was owned by the Leyland Line, which is a subsidiary company of JP Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company. So it was also owned by JP Morgan. Crew members of the ship, including Captain Lord, they all recall seeing 8 white flares go up in the sky. Now, they had no idea what white flares were because red flares were technically the international distress color, but at that time, there was no regulated, internationally recognized, certified color for flares. And because it's the White Star Line, they only carried white flares. But Captain Lord was asking his crewmen, like, yo, did you guys see some flares or something? Because he was down in his cabin, like, sleeping. And they said, yeah, we saw 8 flares. And he says, well, what color were they? And he says, they were white. And he's like, well, that's confusing. I don't know what that means. Maybe they're just like, I don't know, doing a celebration, or like, it could be anything. Who knows? Maybe they're just trying to light up what they're going, like where they're going. Who knows? So they don't end up doing anything. One of the most interesting pieces about the SS Californian is that it did not have any cargo on it. The only thing that it was traveling with was 3,000 wool blankets and wool sweaters. Think about that for a second. The SS Californian had turned its wireless transmitters off, so they were not receiving any messages from anybody. They had no idea what was going on with the Titanic. In fact, they wouldn't find out about what happened to the Titanic until the next morning. But it does seem very peculiar that they were out there kind of just waiting around in the same area that the Titanic ended up going down with wool blankets and wool sweaters, possibly ready to be rescuing cold, wet survivors. To add a little icing on top, Edith Russell, who was a really well-known survivor of the Titanic, she was one of the last people to actually get in a boat because she was so scared of it. But she had this little pig, and they ended up just like throwing her pig in there to try and coax her into getting in the lifeboat. And it worked because it was some sort of like, special pig that probably had it since she was a kid, who knows. But anyways, they threw that in the boat. She gets in this lifeboat. While she was on the ship talking to whoever, crew members, she had asked who is coming to help, like if the ship is going down. And they said, the SS Californian is on its way to help us. But that was never the case. They never sent any wireless transmissions. That was never said to anybody. That was never signified. There's no way for them to have gotten information that the Californian was nearby and that they were coming to help. In fact, quite the opposite. The only ship coming to help was the RMS Carpathia. It was about 50 miles away, and that would equate to roughly like 4 or 5 hours of travel. They're going to take a while to get there. Now, this next part, we actually wouldn't find out until years later, but there was another ship that was out near the Titanic and the Californian. It was the SS Sampson. Now, unfortunately, these guys were all out there illegally clubbing seals, but a typical practice would be to set up an anchor spot with the ship, and then they would send out smaller boats to go check out all the icebergs and the different ice cliffs looking for these seals, and then club them, I guess. But in order to get these guys to come back, if it was dark out, they would shoot up white flares, because it would obviously illuminate, and it would be a signal to let them know, like, yo, come back to the ship. And because they started seeing the flares from the Titanic, and they were seeing the lights from multiple ships, including the Californian, they were starting to get freaked out. So they hightailed it back after their guys got back to the ship, and then they cruised out of there. So they didn't help either. There's a lot of speculation that the white flares that the Californian was seeing might have actually just been from the SS Sampson. I also saw some conflicting reports about the actual flare color from the Titanic. Some of them said that they were red, white, and blue. Some of them said that they were all white. I'm pretty sure in the movie they shoot up white ones with red, which I also saw another report that said they shot up one with red and white at the same time. And these were from like survivor accounts, so you don't really know how fallible that memory is. I mean, they're in a state of shock. It's super traumatic. I don't know how well they'd actually remember something as small as the color of the flares, but I'm not really sure. By the time the Californian realized that maybe they should turn on their wireless transmitter stuff and see if they can reach out to the Titanic, they were unable to get a hold of them. And that's likely because the Titanic was halfway underwater and most of the people were just trying to get off the boat. Oh, and this is just a quick little fun fact for you guys, because I know you love fun facts. But there's tons of reports saying that the band was playing the entire time the Titanic was going down, all the way till the end, and that is entirely not true. I heard multiple accounts from different survivors saying that is not true. Edith Russell being one of them. They were playing that night. They were charged with playing for a little while, but after a certain point, they stopped playing.
I don't doubt that they were playing music. Other people heard it. But when people say that music played as the ship went down, that is a ghastly, horrible lie. And then the horrible fear was in my heart, and I think everybody else's, that the dreadful, dreadful suction that had drawn us towards the Titanic would suck us under the Titanic.
Finally, at 2:20 a.m., with the bow of the ship almost entirely underwater, the ship finally sinks. And there is multiple different accounts that I read and heard, pictures that I saw, and it was all very conflicting. I heard a lot of survivors say that the ship just went straight down. They don't mention it breaking in half at all. I do have other survivors that mention that the ship did in fact break in half, and then they separated into two pieces. but they both sunk by going straight down. Very similar to how the movie portrayed it. But then I was looking for pictures of the Titanic to put in my thumbnails, and I realized that all of the old pictures and the old descriptions of the Titanic sinking very specifically show the Titanic sticking very high up out of the water in one piece. So it made me wonder, where did this two-piece theory come from? And of course, it is in fact sitting in two pieces at the bottom of the ocean, and that certainly could have happened from it lifting up out of the water and snapping in half. I mean, that honestly makes a lot of sense. But when you see the back half, the stern half of the ship, it looks like it got blown up and obliterated. And yet the front half of the ship doesn't really look like that. It's fairly well intact. Obviously, it doesn't look great, but it's fairly well intact. And because of the rising tension with Germany at the time, there are theories saying that maybe a German U-boat actually hit the Titanic with a torpedo, which might explain why the back half of the stern is so destroyed. Like I mentioned before, the Carpathia is the only ship that is near enough to actually do something, as well as the only ship that seems to have known that something was happening. So they end up making their way there. They show up at about 4 a.m., and that's when they rescue about 705 people in lifeboats and people that are floating around in the water with their life vests on, and they load them all up, and then they begin their trek to finish their journey and head to New York. Now, like I mentioned before, some of the news reports that came out in the local newspapers seem to have information that I don't really understand how they got this information that quickly. Of course, the Titanic sunk on April 14th, early morning on the 15th, so it would be kind of crazy that news reports would already be printed on April 15th. But that is in fact what happened. They were reporting all kinds of different numbers about how many people were on board, how many people were lost at sea, all these different things that they could have no way of knowing. One of the other reports that I found very interesting actually came out the following day on April 16th, just one day after the ship had sunk. The Carpathia had not even returned yet because it wouldn't show back up to New York until April 18th. But somehow this newspaper reports that John Jacob Astor IV, considered to be one of the richest men in the world at that time, for sure the richest guy on the Titanic, was for sure passed away. John Jacob Astor came from a long line of rich family members because his family had set up a fur trading monopoly. He really became prominent and well known in the US because of his real estate ventures, and he was a really big investor as well, just investing in different industries, likely railroad stuff, a lot of retail stuff, but he was a really wealthy, elite American individual. It would in fact be confirmed on April 22nd during the collection of all the bodies floating around, during the search for all the bodies, basically the cleanup after the wreck. It was confirmed that John Jacob Astor IV was in fact one of the people who died on the Titanic, and his body was severely crushed, so they think that one of the funnels that was sticking out of the Titanic might have fallen down and crushed him, because they did fall down once the ship had kind of stood up on its one end. Also, just another quick little fun fact for you guys. Did you know that only 3 of the funnels on the Titanic were even functional? The 4th one was just for show. In order to be like the biggest ocean liner at the time, they thought it would look really dumb to only have 3 smokestacks because other ships had 3 smokestacks. So they wanted it to have 4. So the 4th one didn't really do much. It just ventilated out like the boiler room and the lower levels where like the big engines and turbines were. So you'd see a little bit of steam or smoke coming out, but it was not a fully functional smokestack like the other 3.
We all know Titanic's 4th funnel was just a dummy to make the ship look better, right? Well, no, not really. It played a few key jobs. For one, it actually did vent smoke, being an extraction point for some of the ship's kitchens, as well as the fireplace from the first-class smoking room. This was the only functioning fireplace on the ship, and if not for this funnel, the fireplace would have had to have been an electric heater. But it also drew in heaps of fresh air for the turbine room below, and ships that didn't have a ventilating funnel for the engine rooms like Lusitania needed to clutter the decks up above with lots of big vents and skylights just to bring the fresh air in and draw the hot, stale air out. That's not the best part though. The funnel also had ladders in it and a platform at the top, so engineers could climb up and take a breather. You can even see a person's head at the top of the funnel in this famous photo of Titanic. Just because it didn't vent boiler smoke doesn't make it a dummy.
Now you know. Now, of course, John Jacob Astor IV was not the only wealthy individual on that ship. There was a lot of them. In fact, a lot of wealthy people got on that ship because of the allure of J.P. Morgan being on it. It was such a world craze at the time that anybody who's anybody was going to be on that maiden voyage. And of course, it's only going to be loaded with the most wealthy individuals because a first-class ticket for one of the nicest rooms on the Titanic cost $4,350, which in today's equivalent would be about $133,000 for this one trip. It's insane. One of the other wealthy elite figures that was on the Titanic when it went down was Benjamin Guggenheim, whose family became really prominent and wealthy because of their mining and smelting endeavors. And then the other person that was on there was Isidor Straus. Him and his wife were actually portrayed in the movie because they didn't want to leave from one another. And so they decided to just go back to their stateroom and they just went down with the ship together.
Please, Ida, get into the boat. No! Where you go, I go. Don't argue with me, Isidore. You know it does no good.
Isidor Straus was the owner of Macy's department stores, and of course, huge retail, likely an investor as well. The connection with all of these guys is that they supposedly were against having a central bank in the United States. Up until about 1907, the US would continuously experience these financial crises. And in 1907, J.P. Morgan, as well as the Rothschild family from the UK, had to help America, basically bail America out. J.P. Morgan got all these investors and these big bankers, and he got them together and essentially had them donate money to the American government. In order to prevent this from happening in the future, J.P. Morgan suggested that there should be a central bank. This had been a source of contention for many years, basically since the days of Andrew Jackson, who also opposed a central bank because it's literally built into our Constitution. There shouldn't be a central bank because that's exactly how England operated, and they didn't want one entity to have that kind of control over the money supply. Originally, J.P. Morgan and his banking friends, they held a secret meeting with a guy named Alan Aldridge, and they came up with what's known as the Aldridge Plan, which is essentially a precursor to the Federal Reserve Bank. People were quick to realize that this was just a bunch of Wall Street bankers that were trying to capitalize and monopolize this central bank, essentially. So they turned it down and were very quick to criticize it. What J.P. Morgan didn't know is that he would soon get help from his friends across the pond because they too were hoping that America would establish a centralized banking system, very much like the Bank of England. In the late 1800s, diamond tycoon Cecil Rhodes was dominating the mining industry. He had gotten financial backing from Lord Rothschild as well as J.P. Morgan so that he could get his mining operation off the ground and slowly acquire all of the competing mining operations in that area, essentially monopolizing the diamond mining industry. One of the main companies he acquired was called De Beers,
a team that is known as Stoppers.
And they ran this marketing campaign essentially that was saying that diamonds are forever. And this is how they started increasing the demand for diamonds and started putting it in people's heads that this was a precious stone. In order to maintain that same level of, preciousness, rarity, and maintain the same price point, De Beers and Cecil Rhodes would essentially control the supply and demand of the diamond. In periods where sales were really slow, they would actually buy back their own diamonds to make sure that the price never dropped down. It was never getting discounted. And then in periods where they were in high demand, they wouldn't supply nearly as much so that it would seem like it was a rare, precious stone. In this way, they were able to charge 200% more for the diamond and establish it as a lifelong symbol of love to your partner that now costs $15,000 to $30,000, which is insane. Because Cecil Rhodes was so influential and wealthy, he obviously ran with the elite circle. He had support and backing from the Rothschild family. This guy had connections. Particularly, he was real close with 3 other people. Lord Rothschild, obviously being one, very influential, very wealthy. William T. Stead, he actually owned the Pall Mall Gazette, which was a really popular news media paper that went around in England. Obviously, he controls quite a bit of the media. And he was also really close with a guy named Reginald Brett. He was a confidant and advisor to the royal family. And these four guys were all determined that there was only one way to bring about world peace. And that was essentially imperialism, colonial imperialism. Just go around, conquer all these places, and force them to adopt your culture and your way of life. One of the first places they wanted to start with was South Africa. It had become so segregated with different cultures. There was not as strong of an imperial rule down there, and they wanted to take their power back. In order to accomplish this goal, they felt like they had to form a secret society, and their sole goal of this secret society was to slowly absorb the world's wealth, and then once they controlled the money, they could essentially control anything and everything. So that's exactly what they did. They started what's known as the Society of the Elect. Essentially, this is what I would consider to be the start of the Cabal, at least in England, because they said directly that they modeled their secret society after that of the Jesuits and the Freemasons. So what? Kind of makes you think that maybe it's not one giant cabal, it's all these little cabals that are actually connected at the top somehow. Kind of interesting. The Society of the Elect would have people that worked really close with them, and one of their closest friends and members would be Alfred Milner. Now, they sent Alfred Milner down basically to instigate the Boers War down in South Africa, which would eventually lead to British rule coming back to South Africa. Now, this isn't all speculation or conjecture. This is fact. These are actual facts that truly did happen. They've been released in documents that have been released after, 100 years. Also, Cecil Rhodes himself said in a newspaper interview that the only way to achieve world peace would be for a secret society to be formed that slowly absorbs all of the world's wealth. That way they can redistribute it and control the economy. Essentially, if they controlled the money, they could control people, countries, leaders, anything. And in order to control the world's wealth, obviously you have to conquer and take over those different countries, and then that wealth will start flowing to you, or at least establish your people running that country, which is exactly what they tried to do. But they knew that they were nothing if they couldn't get America to side with Britain on this matter. So they started scheming and thinking of ways that they could entice America to kind of join this cabal, essentially, this whole secret society that they had formed. And who is the perfect person to be that guy? Well, the monopoly guy, of course, JP Morgan. But like we mentioned before, JP Morgan was already trying to start a Federal Reserve Bank because he knew that the Federal Reserve would allow all these wealthy bankers to essentially control the finances of the United States. But because it didn't pass through, they knew that they needed some extra support in political office to be able to help them pass this through. At this time, one of the connections that this cabal had in the United States outside of JP Morgan, at least in the political realm, was a guy named Edward M. House. He went by Colonel House, even though he wasn't a colonel. I think he just thought it sounded cool, I don't know. But he was a trusted political advisor to the governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, a relatively unknown governor, was not in any way very popular. They figured he would be the perfect candidate to try and push to political office so that he could help them pass this Federal Reserve Act. Because of Colonel House and the influence that they had in promoting Woodrow Wilson and just showing that he's a man for the people, they ended up electing him. Even though he only got 42% of the vote, that's because they enticed Teddy Roosevelt to run as a third party, which ultimately split the Republican vote in half or whatever. So his 42% vote allowed him to win the presidency. In 1913, not only did the Federal Reserve Act pass, which established a central banking system in the US, it also passed the federal income tax. Terrible year. Bad year. Now, the reason this is all important in relation to the Titanic sinking is because we have at least 3 very powerful, very influential, very opposed members of the US wealthy elite system who were not really involved in financing or banking. They were more involved in retail and industry. So with all of these other financiers controlling the wealth of the country, it could mean that the value of their banks and their money might actually go down. And it could also mean that they lose stake in certain things because they're not controlling the money. These big bankers and financiers are controlling the money. They're just really wealthy guys from being profitable in the industry. But there was many, many more wealthy elite people from Britain and from the US on the Titanic. So who's to say that there wasn't more people opposed to the Fed than we even think? It is kind of suspicious that JP Morgan decided to cancel his trip on the Titanic, as well as 50 of his closest business associates and friends. Who knows how many more people canceled their trip on the Titanic because they were tipped off that this thing's going to go down. Do you really think that JP Morgan would sink his own ship? Why would he do that? Now, we've already talked about the extensive damages to the Olympic that were caused by that collision with the HMS Hawk. With these damages, they filed a claim with their insurance, but unfortunately, they found that the Olympic was actually at fault for that accident. So instead of actually getting a payout, they had to cover the repairs of their own ship as well as the repairs of the HMS Hawk. In January of 1912, JP Morgan decided to re-up on the policy for his insurance, but he combined both the Olympic and the Titanic under one policy. Each ship was insured for $1 million, which is actually less than what each ship cost to build. They were both insured, and it was considered to be the biggest insurance marine investment at that time. JP Morgan knew that if there was any opposition, especially from other wealthy elite individuals that had amazing power and influence over their circle and over their industry, he knew that there was going to be intense opposition to this Federal Reserve Act being passed. So it's kind of interesting that all of these really wealthy, influential people all ended up passing away on the Titanic. But even more interesting is that some people say JP Morgan ended up sinking the Titanic so that he could claim in on this insurance policy, but they actually lost money on this insurance policy. And this reputation that they just got from the Titanic sinking was not a good look. That's essentially what sunk the company, pun intended. What I felt like was more plausible is that JP Morgan really did want to just get rid of these guys. He wanted to eliminate any competition, any opposition, and pave the way for him and these other wealthy bankers to control not only business in the US, but the money supply. But they had just built the Titanic. It's brand new. So why would they want to sink that ship? And it already had a twin sister ship that was nearly identical. They were both being worked on in the same dry dock for an extended period of time, and they both underwent small renovations during that time period. And you'd have to imagine that at this time, there was tons of people that were sailing ships, buying ships, insuring ships. So fraud in the way of, switching a ship for another ship was not unheard of. So there's a lot of folks out there that believe that the Olympic might have been switched just before this maiden voyage and was actually labeled the Titanic. And this was just an expendable ship. It was a money pit anyways, and if they send it to the bottom of the ocean, the deepest, darkest part of the North Atlantic, then nobody can see what's down there. Nobody can know any of the truth about this ship. And they honestly probably didn't expect that we'd have crazy submersible submarine things with cameras now, but he didn't think that anybody would ever find it down there. But there are some really key points to bring up in relation to the switch theory. First, there's many pictures of the Titanic, and you can see a spot on the ship that just looks like it has more fresh paint than anywhere else. Almost like it had been patched. Maybe like it was patched from a collision with the HMS Hawk. There's even images that are supposedly taken of the ship at the bottom of the ocean that show this very spot. And it even shows the two supporting metal rods that were placed to support and reinforce that hull that we were talking about earlier that had to happen to the Olympic. There's also pictures of J. Bruce Ismay's stateroom cabin from the Olympic, which had a fireplace in it surrounded by marble tile. As you know, marble pieces are all very Pacific. They all have very Pacific designs and, marbliness to them. There's underwater footage of this very same marble fireplace down at the bottom of the ocean with the very same marble patterns.
These rooms, they were called the Millionaire Suites. We went into the one that was reserved for JP Morgan. To be able to go into that room and see that marble fireplace still sitting there, and to be able to compare our video with a period photograph of the time and look at the veining in the marble and realize it's the same thing. It was like a fingerprint. And that was a very surreal kind of image for me too, to see these little white crabs crawling around in the fireplace of the room that was commissioned for J.P. Morgan.
But that's not all. Because the names of the ships were actually like engraved into the side of the steel of the ship, it wasn't, riveted in, it couldn't just fall off. Over time, the color and the paint is gonna go away, and eventually rivets or anything that's down there is gonna slowly start to erode and fall apart. But there is an image of the side of the ship, and you can very clearly see in the area where the name is, the letter M and the letter P. I tried to find the letter M and the letter P in the word Titanic, and I was not able to do it. Probably the most interesting thing that we found at the ocean floor, though, is going to be the starboard propeller blade. And if you recall earlier in our story, the Olympic had to have its starboard propeller blade switched because, well, it was damaged. It's very likely that they had taken a propeller blade from the not quite finished Titanic to accelerate the process of fixing the Olympic. Lo and behold, on the ocean floor, when we see this photo of this propeller blade, the number on the blade is in fact 401. Now I know what you're thinking. Shouldn't it be 401? All of the Titanic's hull was technically 401. Yes, that is true. But this is literally the only thing that I've seen on the ocean floor that has the number 401 on it. It very well could still be the Olympic. This could just be the swapped propeller blade from the Titanic. And I also found this picture. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with it. This iconic photo of the propeller blades of the Titanic. But there's another picture of the same propeller blades, just from a different angle. And when you look at those propeller blades of the Titanic, the hull number on there is 400, not 401. What's going on here? There's also this really interesting image that shows the actual crash at the ocean floor. It shows the design of the windows. And like we talked about earlier, the A and B decks had been remodeled on the Titanic, but there had also been tons of remodeling done in that period before it took its maiden voyage. The one on the ocean floor certainly looks like the Olympic in this picture, not the Titanic. These windows are all strangely unevenly spaced. But then I found this photo from 1913 of the Olympic, and look at these little slanted windows. They're all unevenly spaced, just like the one at the ocean floor, just like the Titanic was originally. We've also got Chief Officer Henry Wilde saying that he still doesn't like this ship, referring to the Titanic, but it would honestly make more sense if he was referring to the Olympic, because that was the ship that he was the chief officer on. And one of the last pieces I found to be extremely interesting was during the British inquiry into what happened to the Titanic, White Star Line director Harold Sanderson actually confused the name Titanic with Olympic and upwards of 12 times. And this is all recorded in his testimony in a PDF document online. Also, this entire British inquiry, conducted by Lord Mercy, Lord of Mercy, and Sidney Buxton, was a complete whitewash. These guys are both documented Freemasons, and you can only imagine that they were not really looking to figure out what happened to the Titanic. Even worse than that, they exonerated every single person who technically was at fault for what happened to the Titanic, including Captain Smith, despite his negligence in cruising too fast and not being available, being at a dance, hanging out when all of this was going down. They exonerated everybody. They exonerated the White Star Line. They exonerated the guys who were in the crow's nest. Nobody was at fault for what happened to the Titanic except for Stanley Lord, captain of the SS Californian. They said that he is solely responsible because he didn't do anything to help the Titanic, and he was the closest one, so he could have done it. But in my eyes, it almost seems like he's the one that messed up their plan. He was supposed to be there, save tons of people, not have it be this huge catastrophe, essentially be their savior. But he never showed up. It's also worth mentioning that even after smashing into this iceberg, Captain Smith still allowed the ship to keep moving forward for about 5 minutes in the same direction that the Californian was known to be. And the reason that we know this is because Captain Lord had sent a wireless transmission to Captain Smith earlier in the day, letting him know his exact position. Why? They're not even with the same liners. They have nothing to do with each other. Why would he need to know his exact position? Unless he was out there with wool sweaters and blankets to save all these people. And if in fact that is the Olympic down there at the bottom of the ocean, then it kind of makes you wonder about Ocean Gate's Titan, which eerily enough has the same name as the wreck of the Titan, the book that foreshadowed the Titanic. So were they ever meant to make it down to the bottom of the ocean? Were they supposed to take a look at what was down there? Maybe they weren't. So after digging just a little bit beneath the surface, there's a lot of things that are very peculiar and don't quite add up. In fact, there's quite a few people out there that consider this to be the 9/11 of the 20th century, because very similar to the Twin Towers filled with asbestos, insurance played a role in this story too. Lots of lives were lost for personal gain. And I know there's a lot of you guys out there right now wondering, who cares? What's so bad about the Federal Reserve Bank? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is supplied financially by 12 Federal Reserve state banks. These banks are all given an equal share, an equal portion, and none of these banks can write out stocks or bonds, so they can't help out any private industries. None of these banks or these investors into the Federal Reserve Banks, they don't really get any big payouts because they're all given the same percentage of dividends, and they're all paid out the same based on their contributions to this bank. So they're not making tons of money. However, what's more valuable than money? Power, which is exactly what we're talking about today. Today's addiction is power and greed. Of these 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the New York Federal Reserve Bank is the strongest, the most influential, and of course has the most money. Probably because it's so close to Wall Street, the people that live in that area typically have a higher income, and more than anything, this is where all of the business was going on in America at that time. So the connections with foreign affairs and especially England, that was probably the best place to do it. They were doing transatlantic ships back and forth, and there was a heavy influence from this English secret society pushing for this central banking system in the US. And the reason for that is the central banking system very closely mimics the Bank of London. It operates almost the same exact way. And we know how powerful the Rothschild family is, and how powerful Cecil Rhodes is, and Alfred Milner. All of these guys, very powerful. And their sole goal for world peace is to slowly absorb the world's money supply. And if they can get somebody like JP Morgan or Woodrow Wilson or someone in power who they can play and they can be the puppeteer, then they control pretty much all of America. And they're slowly starting to work on Europe at this time. Ultimately, this is what would lead to the sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat, which the Lusitania was actually an arms ship carrying tons of ammo, guns, and arms stuff. And the Lusitania was literally sailing right through German U-boat infested waters. This all happened very shortly after King George was having a conversation and had mentioned that maybe we can get the Americans to support our wars that we have going on over here in Europe if we take out some of their citizens. And the Lusitania was carrying quite a few American passengers. 2 hours later, after this conversation, suddenly the Lusitania is blown up by a torpedo from a German U-boat. Who tipped them off? Maybe somebody told them, this thing's carrying arms. You need to make sure that this doesn't make it, blah, blah, blah. Something's up. Now I could keep going because this really does lead us right into World War I. And this is the first chance that the American central banking system gets to test the power, because they will end up fully funding our presence in World War I. But going back to the Federal Reserve, specifically the New York Fed, why is this bank so powerful? Just to bring us up to present day, I wanted to go through who the major shareholders of the New York Federal Reserve Bank actually are. Who are these investors? Who are these people that are donating money so that this New York Federal Reserve has reserves to then contribute to the national central bank? Well, let's go through it. And I've got some notes here, so don't mind this, but the New York Federal Reserve main stockholders are Citibank, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley Private, Goldman Sachs, and the Bank of New York Mellon. There's foreign banks that also have stake in the New York Federal Reserve, which is kind of weird that foreign entities have anything to do with our money supply. But the London HSBC Holdings PLC, the Deutsche Bank and Trust, the Japan Mizuho Bank, and the Commercial Bank of China. All of these guys own stock in the New York Federal Reserve. So I wanted to look a little closer at exactly what percentage they own of the Federal Reserve Bank. Starting off, we've got Citibank has 42.8% of the shares. JP Morgan holds 29.5% of those shares. Those two companies together have about, 70% of the New York Federal Reserve Bank under their control. Then we've got Goldman Sachs and the Bank of New York Mellon. So I wanted to see, okay, well, these are all big banks, major corporations, also publicly traded and owned by other companies. And as I started to look into it, man, I wasn't even surprised. Citibank, top 3 stockholders are Blackrock, Vanguard, and State Street. JP Morgan, top 3 shareholders, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Goldman Sachs, top 3 stockholders, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. The Bank of New York Mellon, top stockholders, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Literally every single one of them is owned and controlled by these same 3 companies. But you want to hear something even crazier? Okay, BlackRock, guess who their top 3 stockholders are? Yeah, you guessed it, BlackRock Inc., Vanguard, and State Street. And guess what? It's the same for the other 2. Vanguard and State Street are owned by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. State Street is owned by BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. They're all owned by each other. All 3 of these Ashkenazi-owned corporations own each other. And they also own majority stock shares in all of the banks that contribute to the New York Federal Reserve. The New York Federal Reserve has the most influence over the Central Federal Bank of America. So it certainly does seem that a secret society is slowly accumulating all of the world's wealth in an effort to achieve world peace. So I don't know, you guys. I want to know what you think, because we went through a lot of information, all very interesting, and suddenly the idea of a secret society, a secret cabal, does not sound so far-fetched. But I think I say this every week, I did not expect the Titanic to be as interesting or as deep as it is laying on the ocean floor right now, but that was quite literally a rabbit hole. And I want to thank my son Bodhi for his Titanic obsession, for bringing this topic to me. I don't know what it is about kids in the Titanic, but there's something about them that just knows something ain't right. But that's all I got for you guys this week. I really appreciate you sitting down for this long, listening to the story of the Titanic that you probably haven't heard before. But I look forward to doing this again with you guys next week for another one. But until then, sleep safe, stay sober, and wear your life vest. Later, sobers.
Get to the chopper, the Titanic's going down!
Let's go.